The myth of the Alamo gets the history all wrong. Instead of heroes or heroic stance for freedom, Texas fought to be able to enslave people. The Alamo is best known as the site of a legendary 1836 battle, but the popular understanding of the history of that battle gets the causes all wrong. The 1836 battle for the Alamo is remembered as David versus Goliath story. A band of badly outnumbered Texans fought against oppression by the Mexican dictator Santa Anna, holding off the siege long enough for Sam Houston to move the main rebel forces east, providing them a rallying cry at the Battle of San Juanita. As almost any Texan will tell you, their heroic sacrifice turned the Alamo into the cradle of Texas liberty. Yet, the legend of the Alamo is a Texas tall tale run amok, complete fabrication of history. The actual story is one of white supremacy, immigrants to Texas revolting in large part over Mexicans' attempt to end slavery. Far from heroically fighting for a noble cause, they fought to defend the most odious of practices. Our newfound understanding of this history presents Americans with a long overlooked opportunity to correct a racist myth surrounding this monument. Anglo settlers began arriving in Texas from the United States in the 1820s, when it was part of a Spanish Mexico. The Spanish government wanted them as a bulwark against the Comanche, but these new Texans had another agenda. When these dichotomous visions became clear in 1822, a newly independent Mexican government in Mexico City paused further settlement. The problem, according to Stephen F. Austin, known as the father of Texas, was that the new government, which took power on a racial equality agenda, would not stand by for slavery. The Mexican government efforts to write a new federal constitution got bogged down. One of the sticking points was the question of slavery. The new government wanted slavery gone, but ending the practice would ruin the settlers. Austin talked to each individual member of the junta of the necessity which existed in Texas for the new colonists to bring their slaves. So the Mexican government struck a deal with Austin. The deal allowed settlers to keep their enslaved people, but banned any further trade. Enslavement took root, and in 1823, Austin received permission to increase immigration from the United States. The constant turnover and instability in Mexican City proved problematic. For the Texans, in 1824, a new government was proposed, measures to undo the understanding over slavery. One bill outlawed commerce and traffic in slaves, and stated that any enslaved person brought into Mexico would be doomed free by the mere act of standing on Mexican soil. The state constitution of 1827 allowed settlers to import enslaved people for 6 months. And that September, however, yet another new government in Mexico City passed a flurry of laws curbing slavery. By 1828, Texans had settled on the unsustainable practice they would ignore anti-slavery laws passed in Mexico City. Discussion that the government might actually enforce the 1827 laws, though, brought talk of war. Many have announced to me that there would be a revolution if the law takes effect, a Mexican military commander in East Texas wrote to a superior. Austin's colony would be the first to think along these lines. It was formed for slavery, and without it, her inhabitants would be nothing. This talk of secession brought crackdowns from the Mexican government, including taxes on cotton to pay for military installations in Texas, and an order to close the border with the United States. Austin sunk into a depression. Mexico was threatening the foundation of Texans. Nothing is wanted but money, Austin wrote in one letter, adding in another, and Negroes are a necessity to make it. In April 1832, the Mexican government closed the loopholes, allowing settlers to reclassify their human chattel as indentured servants. This finally outlawed slavery, full stop. For Austin, this was the last straw. Texas must be a slave country, he wrote to a friend. Circumstances and unavoidable necessity compel it. He saw only two options: a separate Mexican statehood for Texas with legal slavery, or rebellion, no middle course left, he wrote. When the Mexican government granted Santa Anna dictatorship or dictatorial powers in 1834, Mexican states revolted. The Mexican army marched north to put down the rebellion. In Matagorda, a group of Anglo settlers declared that merciless soldiers was coming to give liberty to our slaves and to make slaves of ourselves. The Texas leadership justified the war as a fight to preserve their natural rights, and that word again, their property, meaning their enslaved laborers. Even in Washington, it was clear what drove the Texans abolitionists denounced their insurgency as the world's first pro-slavery rebellion. The war now raging in Texas charged former President and Representative John Quincy Adams was a war for the reestablishment of slavery where it was abolished. It is not a servile war, but a war between slavery and emancipation. And recovery, and every possible effort has been made to drive us into war on the side of slavery. The Texas revolt may have been precipitated by ham-handed Mexican attempts to exercise control over its territory, but the underlying cause was one thing American immigrants and the Mexican government had disagreed on since the beginning, and that was the preservation of slavery. Given that its defenders were fighting to form what became the single most militant slave nation in history, that men who fought at the Alamo, like Jim Bowie and William Travis, traded enslaved people. And Austin, the father of Texas, spent years fighting to preserve slavery from the attacks on Mexican abolitionists. It is clear that rather than a courageous stand for liberty, the white men fighting for the Alamo were battling to own people of color. To many Texans, the Alamo is a secular shrine to conservative values on par with the Confederate monument. A metaphor made literal. In 2019, when the Texas Senate specifically included the Alamo in legislation to protect Confederate monuments from removal. The debate over the history of white supremacy has only expanded since then. Most recently in debates over the teaching critical race theory, and with the first national reckoning of the Tulsa massacre. With the debate over our past increasingly fraught, re-examining the Alamo's history shines a spotlight on how slavery played a role in the formation of the Southwest and how its impact has lingered, fueling the ethos at the core of Texas identity. what it boils down to is the Alamo was nothing more than a fight for slavery. They used to sell slaves at the Alamo. Texans have been living a lie for almost 200 years. They were not a group of proud men fighting for democracy and independence. They were fighting harshly for the enslavement of people, blacks to be exact. Now my understanding is why are Texas today so critical of history. And they don't want any history taught in school about the slavery of blacks. They don't want to hear about CRT, critical race theory. Why? Because it upends their bullshit for the last 200 years. Texas is founded on nothing but lies. Their proud Texas Alamo is nothing but a fight for slavery. And I hope people look it up. Don't take my word for it. Look it up and judge for yourself. Texas is not a proud nation for independence. The Alamo, that's a joke. Thank you.